that's when I was able to convince my dad, hey, let's do a big renovation, move to a franchise, give it a shot. And so he was, at that time, he was still very against it, but I kind of pushed it hard and shoved it down his throat. And then, fast forward a few years and he, finally admits that that was a good move just because, the top line revenues were, were reaching points that he never thought, you could get as a non-franchise hotel.
I think to start out, I'd love to just hear, as far as your family story, when did you move to America and what business did your parents first get into?
We moved to America in 1982. So literally I was probably 3 or 4 months old. Kind of an interesting story there. The day that I was born, my parents got their visas as I was being born. And so they decided they wanted to give me an American name. And apparently the only one they could think of was Keni. And they spelled it wrong, Keni. We arrived at JFK in May of 82. My dad's older brother had arrived in the US probably in the mid to late 70s, and he had a hotel. He was running it and living on property. And so when we arrived not just with myself and my parents, but also my dad's 2 sisters and their children. We kind of all came, at one time, and we all moved in to the eldest brother's motel. And so there was probably at that time, probably around 18 people total. And so that's where we kind of arrived, and everyone did what they could to help out at the motel and get accustomed to the United States. My parents, probably within the first month or so, landed jobs. My dad worked at a gas station as a cashier, and my mom got a job at a sewing factory pretty quickly. I think my dad got held up at gunpoint probably within the first couple of months, and so he was like, "This is terrible." And then my mom she just flat out did not enjoy working for an employer, kind of like when they were in India. All folks that are the last name Patel, most of them in India, they own some sort of farmland, right? They're farmers. And so, my family has owned sugarcane farms for, generations there. And so that was kind of their primary business. So it is, they come from an entrepreneurial state where the primary path there is kind of some sort of business ownership. And of course, a lot of farmland farming. After that, I think they spent probably about a year or so getting their bearings in the U.S., working odd jobs, helping, my dad's eldest brother at their motel. And then during that time, my dad's older brother was kind of on the prowl for available motels, right? So they would be traveling around the tri-state figuring out, okay, where can we make a deal and, get my brother, my 2 sisters set up. And so I think about a year passed and my uncle found a motel, a 17-unit motel in Connecticut for my dad. And so they figured out, how do we get the capital together to acquire this place? And we moved there.
And how were you guys able to finance that? Or your parents able to finance that at that point?
Yeah, so back then, this was probably a few $100,000 deal, but still significant. I mean, even in the 80s, right? And so most of the capital was from family and friends. So, my dad's older brother gave what he could, but there's a pretty large network of folks from India, from the same state, last name Patel. And so we had other extended family, a lot of friends. And so whoever could loan $1,000, $5,000, so they gathered up as much capital as they could. But during that time, even though interest rates were high, financing was kind of prevalent. And interest rates were very high. I think when they purchased this motel, I think their interest rate was on the order of 12% or something. And so, but they were able to get financing as kind of, being green card holders in the US. And so, so it was a combination of friends and family and then bank financing.
I want to talk more about that financing network, kind of the friends and family that exists within the Patel community. But can you kind of just explain what is a Patel? Because I think your average person in America would just think, they might think they're all related, but...
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, the last name Patel, obviously, if you meet one Patel, they're most likely not related to another Patel that you might know. It's kind of like, I explained it that it's kind of like the last name Smith. So in the state of Gujarat in India, but a large proportion of the population, the last name is Patel. And that kind of goes back, just like Smith, right? It goes back to the lineages like blacksmiths, right? That was their trade. And so Patel is kind of equivalent to farmer. And so in India, Patel almost means not much, right? And so that's why they'll tack on your first name, your middle name, right, which is typically your father's name and maybe even your grandfather's name, and that's how you like delineate your like true identity.
Yeah. Okay. And as far as the region, you've mentioned a few times now, there's a lot of farmers. Is that truly why that region of India skews towards entrepreneurship? It's just, coming from America, I feel like most folks, they wouldn't think of, when they think of the word entrepreneur, most people aren't even, farmers maybe bottom of the list as far as what they think of from an entrepreneurial perspective.
In that region, so in Gujarat, there's a city that was long considered the sugar capital of the world in terms of processing sugarcane to make sugar wafers to distribute all over the globe. It was like the capital, and it might probably still up there today. But obviously, that processing plant, that city was located around a plethora of sugarcane farms. And so it was a generational thing, right? I mean, our sugarcane farms go back probably 6-7 generations. And so that is basically the business that all of the children would get into. And so it's pretty interesting, right? Where, the region dictates kind of what path you take in life. And it was just, it was a prevalence of ownership of farmland that led to it. And actually, like a lot of folks in that region choose that path versus going off to college and, going off to a career, right? Versus if you go like to the south of India, the city centers, right? Obviously, India's a big producer of, IT talent, but in this little enclave of this state, it is all farming, what was all farming driven.
Yeah. And do you know when, I don't think there's too much debate around this, but when the first sort of Patels came to India and became, started getting into the motel/hotel business? Because I do know there's a group that was already, for some reason, moved to Uganda, and then they were basically outlawed and kicked out of the country.
Yeah,
so I know
that group of Indians like went to Uganda just for, additional opportunities, right? They might not have come from land ownership. And so that didn't go well, obviously, but I think the Patels originated from India, not from Uganda.
Yeah. I'm going to butcher the name, but in prepping for this, it's Kanji Desai. Do you know, is that the first true hotelier who kind of started
that's kind of a pretty well-known name. I think, he arrived here in the 40s. Okay, so one of the first from India. His last name was not Patel, but he was of the same state from Gujarat. And I believe he crossed into California from Mexico. So he was undocumented, right? In the 40s. He happened to check in at like a Japanese American owned, it was like kind of more like a hostel. And he was living there, but then, World War II and the Japanese internment, the owner of that hotel was interned, and he basically struck a deal with them to lease that hotel while they're in internment. And so he essentially took that hotel over, and then, I think it was a number of years that he was able to, rent it and operate it. And during that time, he realized what a good business it was. He didn't have to pay housing costs, right? He could be pretty efficient because he's on site all the time. So he started, writing to his family in India, saying, I think this is a great business. Family, friends, when they come over, he encouraged everyone to get into the hotel business. And that's kind of how it started. So, I don't know if you can call it kind of a viral thing.
Yeah.
But I think, the Patel motel, Patel's immigrating from Gujarat to the U.S. Even today, primary goals are, okay, how do we acquire a hotel to get ourselves set up in the United States?
And the financing network that you described earlier, kind of friends and family, the extended Patel community.
Yep.
Does that still exist today? And is that still a method that folks would use rather than just going to get an SBA loan or whatever bank loan that they might be able to get?
So it's when you talk about the family and friends financing. So back in, let's say when my parents came, right? It was very, very handshake, right? It was just handshake deals. I know you, right? We've known each other. We went to school together potentially, right? And so there was a pretty tight cultural, community. There's no real terms. Pay me back when you can, right? And frankly, probably no interest was being charged either. It was just, helping out a fellow Indian. Now it's still prevalent, but it's probably a little bit different where, folks are providing loans for the equity, but also potentially charging a little bit of interest, getting things, a little bit more documented. But still, again, it is still the backbone is the fact that there's a tight-knit culture. And so folks are very incentivized to make good on the loans that they're taking out. And so what will happen today is that folks will definitely need to, still get SBA financing, but for the equity portion, a lot of that can potentially come from friends and family.
Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine, right, if you didn't pay your investors back or somehow you're maybe doing something deceptive, that your reputation within that community would be shot pretty
Exactly.
quickly.
Yeah, it's a big incentive to make good on, any money that you've borrowed from folks.
Yeah. Are there any examples in your mind that, as far as Patel families that have turned that financing network into a massive hotel empire?
Yeah, and I mean, I would say that financing network, it really is in play when folks are new to the United States. They don't have much, capital to bring to the table, and they just need to get one deal, right, in order to make a living. After that, I think that financing network piece kind of trickles away. Meaning, if I arrived here, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, I got one hotel, I'm making a good living. If I want to buy another hotel, then that's going to be, the responsibility is on that person, right, to come up with the equity. They can surely borrow, but I think it's really for the folks that are new to the country and don't have the equity to start off, right? So it's just that initial spark. But, once folks do have income producing, even if it's just one income producing hotel, they're going to take that income, either reinvest it back in their existing hotel or save up and go to property number 2, number 3. So there's a couple of companies that come to mind that have done, that have went from, hey, we arrived here in the 70s or 80s with bought a motel, and then fast forward today, we've got like a very well-established hotel company. So companies like Baywood Hospitality out of Maryland, they probably got over $1 billion portfolio. And then Hawkeye Hotels out of Iowa, saying they're probably over $1 billion. But they have transitioned from kind of individual hotel owner operator all the way to more of a, what you think, like a private equity style, where they're raising capital from folks. And so now it's like, instead of borrowing money from friends and family, they have a strong network, and probably, I would venture to say, a large portion of their investor base is of Indian origin. And so they will bring them in as limited partners.
Okay. I mean, it's just incredible, though. Even obviously, there's a lot of work to get from first location to what you're describing with Hawkeye and Baywood. But that first unit, that's a very hard part for even today with anyone looking to get into franchising. I mean, getting the wheel into the snowball rolling is tough.
Exactly. You just need that. You need that one that works. The one that will teach you the ins and outs of the business and gets you enough cash flow to, to make a living and to save up for, for property number 2.
I want to get to, of course, your direct hotel experience, the ones you own, and even what you see through your day-to-day life. But you grew up in a motel, effectively. So what does that actually look like, growing up in a motel with your family?
Of course, I grew up in a motel from I was a year old up through when I left, up until when I left for college. So I had no idea what living in a house, really meant. But yeah, so I mean, the motel that my parents bought, it was a 17-room exterior corridor motel, and the front desk, right, the office, the reception, check-in area, very small. Right behind that is basically, when you go to a typical hotel and you walk up to the front desk, someone might come out from behind that door, right, and you're like, oh yeah, they're coming out from their office. But in this style, behind that office, behind that door, is basically a living area. So it opened up into a small living room. There was a bedroom and then a kitchen, right? So it was just right on the first floor. And so I think I want to say probably for 6 or 7 years, we kind of just slept in that living room / bedroom. My parents would put out a mattress when the office kind of shuts down, 10 or 11 p.m., it's time to go to bed. It's not like we had staff to run the front desk through the night. They would lock the front door, and someone could ring a bell, and they would lay out a mattress in the living room, and they would go to sleep there. And so when I heard the bell ring, my dad would jump out of bed and walk into the office and buzz the guest in and check them in. Yeah, so he did that. I mean, they did that for many, many, many years. Probably, yeah, even through until I left for college. Even though they took that 17-room motel, they expanded it to about a 45-unit, more of a hotel. But still, they still follow that same model where we had very light staff, especially on the front desk. It was all us kind of operating that. Through the day, I call them like the pioneers of work from home, right? Because they were doing it before it was even a thing. During the day, if, after the morning rush, folks check out, check in, they're kind of, my dad is sitting there watching the news, right? Waiting for the next guest to show up and then walking into the desk, right? eating lunch, eating dinner there. So yeah, that's kind of what it was. And then when they expanded it, they obviously expanded our living situation too. So they added a second floor with a bedroom. So it was more comfortable. But I mean, that model in the motel world still exists today. Pretty much every motel that you see, and by the way, I don't know if I haven't hit on this, is that, like probably about 40% of hotels in the US are owned by folks of Indian origin. But when you look at motels, right, like the older properties, exterior corridor, smaller, the number's probably around 80 to 90%. And so I still have family that own motels and live on site.
Yeah. Was it just every night then? A buzz? At least it had to have happened weekly where someone was showing up
Oh
at
yeah,
2 a.m.
every,
to get a
every
room.
day. So I mean, through the probably 20 plus years that my dad did this straight, you don't have a restful nights of sleep, right? So they would get naps in during the day. But this was all in the name of efficiency, right? In the early days, it wasn't just that they were manning the front desk. It was that they were also doing the housekeeping for all 17 units. And maybe they had some folks come in to help out. But as soon as, AM hit, they would do the same thing. They would lock the office. They would head out to go clean rooms. And the buzzer that they had actually would buzz not just inside, but around the whole property. So even if they were outside, they would hear that buzz and they would run over to the front desk and, work with it, deal with the guest.
Did your family ever take a vacation growing up? Or no, because the motel was quite...
It was not a thing, really. I think I remember the first vacation we ever took was to Universal Studios down in Orlando. And so at that time, they were still very much save as much money as possible. So they got someone to sit at the motel for about a week, and we drove down to Orlando. That was kind of the first vacation that we ever really took.
And what age was that at?
I want to say probably 10 or so.
Okay.
Yeah. But the one thing that they would do is actually, their idea of vacation was going back to India, right? So whenever they could, especially in the low season, in the winter time, they would get someone, right? Potentially another family, let's say, that had just arrived to the US, was potentially working a job. They would say, hey, I want to go to India for a few weeks, a month. I'm going to teach you how to run the motel, and we're going to go off. So that is, they definitely made time for that. So I recall going to India growing up many times.
Yeah.
But that was the primary trip.
Sure. I asked that mainly because I just think it's, the first generation, I just noticed the trend. I mean, there's just an incredible level of sacrifice, right? Where, I had a Little Caesars owner on the show a while ago, and, his father had gotten into Little Caesars first. And I mean, they lived at that store, and slowly grew it. But it's like those first years to grow a portfolio, if you're doing it, without outside capital beyond maybe a little bit of debt or whatever you can afford, on that front, it's just very difficult to grow, and it takes time, nothing but time, right?
It's let it compound.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, when we were growing up, we were basically taught how to answer the phone, right? Check in a guest. Obviously, myself and my sister, as soon as we were old enough, we would be helping my parents be housekeepers, right? I was doing, maintenance when I was a kid, right? So it was basically everyone wore all hats.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was obviously growing up, it was terrible. I hated it. Right? Because weekends were no fun, because weekends were kind of busier. Summer was the worst because that was the high season. So I was wishing that I was just in school versus cleaning rooms every single day.
Holy crap. Yeah, I mean, was it like a franchise? Was it a Motel 6?
No, at that time it was called the Villager Motel. It was 17 rooms, and then when they expanded it, it was 40 something. It was still independent. I think my father was hesitant against franchising for quite a long time. He wasn't willing to give up that 8 to 10% off the top.
Sure.
And frankly, we were in a market that at that time didn't require franchising. I think franchising, especially select service hotels and all of the flags that exist today were really in development during the 80s and 90s, right? But prior to that, it was either, folks are staying at a roadside motel, or folks are staying at a full service hotel with a conference and, restaurants, right? The in-between was not really built out yet.
Yeah. And were you and any siblings getting paid? Or was it just, hey, this is part of the deal, you're in the family?
Yeah, no. We got food and place to live. Yes. But yeah, that wasn't really, it was never even a thought, right? And that was normal. That was really normalized for us, right? It's not like I was looking at other cousins of mine that were doing anything different. Everyone was doing the same thing, right? So it seemed very, very normal.
Yeah. It's just it's for the family. So, wow.
Yeah. Even when we visit family, we would go to their motel. We would visit friends, we would go to their motel, right? We didn't really know anyone that were, that had careers and owned homes. That felt like a different world at the time.
Yeah. And speaking of, we'll get into this more later, but what are the margins when you do run a hotel, as we've been discussing this family owner operator model?
Oh, if you don't factor in the fact that the folks that are working should get some sort of like pay, right?
Yeah.
Then the margins can get, really, really attractive, right? Meaning like 60% plus margins,
Free labor.
And so, you're just scrounging, right? Saving, a dime here and there everywhere you can. There's no, like now modern hotels, even reasonable select service hotels, right? You'll have a general manager, you might have an assistant general manager, you might have a maintenance person, right? But that was none of that. So it was all savings on the labor front, on the payroll front. Yeah, and then maintenance, that's just, you do your full, as much maintenance as you can without having to call in outside help. So that's why the margins get, much better. And now, fast forward to today where, you might still have an economy hotel and it might be franchised, but you can still achieve pretty solid margins on there in terms of NOI margins, just because you can still, a lot of them are still run in that spirit of being very lean and efficient, even if you might not have someone living on site, right?
Okay.
But the idea is you hire staff that you can cross-train really well, right? Meaning your general manager is doing sales, checking folks in, and he's probably got some maintenance skills too, right? So he's running off to rooms to fix issues.
Okay. So it's still the folks who are in the operator shoes, they're still wearing multiple hats even to this day.
Exactly, yeah. And then, that works up until a certain number of rooms. And then you're kind of forced to be more structured and hire for more specialized roles, of course.
Okay. Yeah. And I know for you, you didn't go into the family business immediatent. So
no,
what was the thought process behind that?
Yeah, I wanted out. Right? I couldn't wait to get out. So, I went off to Boston to study engineering, and I was like, that's what I'm going to do, right? I don't want any part of this. I used to tell my parents that, that my parents would say, well, you're going to take over the hotel one day. I was like, as soon as you give it to me, I'm going to sell it.
Yeah.
That's how much I didn't enjoy it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I went off and, studied engineering. I worked for quite a number of years. I took a very short break between a job and starting grad school back in Boston. And I came back to Connecticut to help, to kind of just figure out what I want to do, work with the family a bit. And that's when I was able to convince my dad, hey, let's do a big renovation, move to a franchise, give it a shot. And so he was, at that time, he was still very against it, but I kind of pushed it hard and shoved it down his throat. And then, fast forward a few years and he, finally admits that that was a good move just because, the top line revenues were reaching points that he never thought, you could get as a non-franchise hotel. Even though there's additional cost to servicing those guests, right? Now we're providing free breakfast, right? And a little bit more in terms of amenities, but still, at the end of the day, the bottom line improved, so.
And how did you see other people in the hotel community doing that, and so you knew the numbers, or what made you confident to convince your dad after all those years that this was the right way?
Absolutely, right? I think I was kind of late to the game, right? I did this in my late mid-20s after working for a few years, and there had a lot of my own cousins, a lot of family, friends that I grew up with. They loved the hotel business growing up, and even though if they went off to college, they came right back to the hotel biz, and so they were actually much more kind of experienced in the modern hotel biz, compared to me. So I was able to get a lot of advice, input.
Okay.
And some confidence behind, let's do this.
What franchise was one pursuing you to convert or
Oh yeah, I mean, when there are motels that are in good condition, the franchisors will certainly be, doing their sales thing, trying to convince you to come on board. And so we ended up going with the Days Inn by Wyndham.
Okay.
So.
And just immediately, you just think the marketing efforts they were doing on your behalf just drove the
traffic?
traffic?
The primary thing is that they have a central reservation system, right? They have a rewards program. So they have a kind of a loyal base of repeat guests. And so as soon as you plug into their central reservation systems, more reservations start flowing. And then obviously just the brand recognition from people driving by, right? Even if they're just kind of walk-in guests, they're taking a trip. And if you see a branded hotel versus, never heard of this thing before, the odds are that they're going to try the branded hotel first.
Yeah. Well, so, all right, how many hotels motels do you own today? And then
So
even what's the exposure to hotels from your day job as well?
currently, I've got two hotels, both in Connecticut. They're both in the economy segment. One is 45 units, the other one is about 78 units. So I've got those, and then in terms of the kind of the family portfolio, it's not a primary focus of mine, but I do want to grow that as well. And then I work for more of an institutional investment firm based out of Miami called Driftwood Capital, and Driftwood Capital owns probably 35 hotels. They have a management company that manages about 80 to 90 hotels in total. But in terms of Driftwood Capital, they've got a portfolio of about 5 billion owned assets and under construction. So that's kind of definitely a different game. And then they have a Rolodex of investors, obviously.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
they
Yeah.
primarily focus in Hilton, Marriott hotels, upscale up through luxury.
Yep. Okay. So kind of a different, you're seeing both sides or both spectrum of the market then through what you directly own and then your day job.
Yeah, so I
When
kind of bridged the. It's weird that I bridged like I studied engineering. I worked for as an R&D engineer in defense for like a decade. Shifted to data science, and then somehow made my way to doing data science. This is my third real estate company that I'm doing data science for. Started
yeah.
out with residential real estate, then industrial real estate, and then I got an opportunity to say, basically got headhunted saying, hey, you're already doing data science for real estate. What do you think about doing it for hotels? Like it just made
Yep.
a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So kind of combine both worlds.
That's awesome. Sounds like you're perfect for the job. So talk about like,
That's why I say that it's interesting because especially in the world of real estate, right? It's like you know tech people in real estate is not a huge segment, but
yeah.
I'm sure that they interviewed folks that were much better data scientists than me. But the only reason I got hired was that I actually knew the hotel game, right? Like I knew occupancy,
Yeah.
ADR, very basic things, right? I knew what a hotel P&L looked like, and so if you don't have to teach someone the domain knowledge, then you can move much quicker, of course.
100%. And speaking of the hotel P&L, so like, what are the key metrics? Because I come from the land of franchise disclosure documents, and where the only data you get on franchises is really what they put in the item 19. And I see the stat ADR all the time in the FDDs for these hotel franchises. But like, how do you evaluate is a hotel performing well or not?
It's really interesting because hotels are one of the real estate asset classes that have the most rich data available for evaluating, a deal, right? And I'll kind of zoom out a little bit, meaning in terms of like, how do you assess a market first, and then
Okay.
dig deeper into a hotel. So in the hotel world, most hotels today are franchised, and so you've got a property management system where you're checking guests in and out, right? That keeps track of all of your rates and your occupancy. And so what happens is that all of that data obviously gets piped to the mothership, the brand, Hilton, Marriott, IHG, whoever it may be. And so all of these brands have a partnership with a company called Smith Travel Research that basically take this data and package it up and then play it back to the owners, right? So if I have a hotel in my market in Connecticut and I've got 4 competitors that are my direct competitors because they're in the same geography and maybe they're the same chain scale, they might be economy or mid-scale. And so every week and every month, I'll get a report showing here's your occupancy, here was your ADR, right, which is average daily rate, and here's your RevPAR, revenue per available room. And that it will compare it to my competitive set. And your 4 competitors perform like this. So I can always assess last week, last month, did I outperform on occupancy? Did I underperform on ADR? Right? So that's one great guidepost to gauge your local market and how you're performing against it. And then at the same time, the same company will provide, sub-market level information as well, right? So the U.S. is broken up into 700 different hospitality submarkets. And so if you're able to get this data, it's not free, but you can obtain for a particular market, what is all the inventory that exists in this market. I can take a look at the past 20 years of occupancy, average daily rate, RevPAR, supply that came on and off the line, and I can access this data. And so you can gauge the strength of a market. How did a particular market, perform overall by chain scale, right? How did the economy segment perform? How did the upper mid-scale segment perform during a recessionary period, right? During COVID, right? We can quantify all of that. How quickly did particular markets recover in COVID, after COVID? So there's a lot of rich data that you can use to assess the top line. And then obviously when you get down to a particular property, then the hotel, the expense structure matters a lot.
Yeah. Just on that note of this data licensing, is that the hotel? Did you say that the hotel owners opting into that, or is it the franchises are like, no, we're taking it regardless and giving it to?
If you're a franchise hotel, you are automatically opted into that.
I'm just curious. I mean, it sounds helpful, and I'm sure there's like probably like third parties that would just want access to that data. I don't know if maybe there's like some investment, like an alt data source for some form of an investment. I could see a hedge fund just maybe using that as a proxy for something, but that's totally separate. I guess what I'm asking is why do the hotel companies all cooperate and provide this data? Or is it anonymized and you don't know what the brands are?
Yeah, so when you get they call it a star report, you're actually able to have some flexibility in defining who your competitors are in that market. And so it is anonymized though, right? I can't tell how that Marriott down the street from me is doing or how they did last week, right? All I can say is, hey, I've got 5 competitors in this market and on average this is how they did. So it's anonymized in that way. And so no one receives my particular star report. So every hotel's getting a different one. Their view, right, how they performed, and then everyone, all of your competitors on average, how did they perform?
Oh, that's interesting.
And so, obviously it's a win-win for, I really think it is a win-win because the hotel owners can really dynamically understand, right? How do we do last week? Where do we leave money on the table, right? And you don't just get an insight into occupancy, average daily rate, revenue per available room. You get some insight into the types of business, right? So if your property management system, you'll be able to categorize a guest as a transient, right? They're just passing through. Or this is a corporate guest, right? Maybe we got this from a contract, or some sort of group business, right? We had a wedding group come through. And so you'll actually be able to see those metrics too and say, okay, I got a lot more corporate last week or last month or throughout the year than all of my competitors, right? And so if you're underperforming, you know that, hey, maybe you need to bump up your game in terms of sales. And then obviously these star reports, you'll have regional directors that are assigned to you from the brands, and they'll have access to your star report too. And so they can help you interpret that and come up with new strategies for selling, right? Or for changing the mix of business, right? Potentially, hey, maybe you have a little bit too much corporate and those negotiated rates are low, right? Whereas transient, there's a lot of demand for transient and you can usually get a higher rate from someone that's just kind of passing through and walking into your hotel. So you can kind of play with that, the mix of business.
It's fascinating. And it's just a unique kind of insight, like data insight that hotel operators are getting because it doesn't really exist in, at least in the QSR space or anything like that. And I'm sure QSR operators kind of love that if they could just see, I don't know, if I own Domino's and I'd want to know what the other pizza joints in my area are doing, right? So anyway, that was just more my curiosity. But back to the metrics, I hear you on the expense structure is going to matter a lot, and that'll determine how well or, how poor some operator is doing. But what's like for maybe, let's call it like this economy class. And I don't know if the Motel 6 that's the brand that just keeps coming, like that's a economy brand motel. And then maybe a higher end hotel. What are maybe the revenue numbers where you could just know based off revenue? That's like they're doing well on the top line at a minimum.
Yeah, it's usually, just knowing the revenue number is not going to help you much, but knowing the revenue per key can help.
Okay.
So, if you've got a $2 million top line, well, how many rooms is that on? If that, 50 versus 75 versus 100 keys, that can be a gauge, right? So you can say, okay, if you know the top line revenue of a hotel, the number of rooms, right? And if you have access to kind of the broader sub-market level average occupancy, average rate by chain scale, then you can back out and just at least make a top line assessment of, is this hotel outperforming the market, underperforming the market, right? And then it's your job to, gauge why is that, right? It could be, if it's underperforming, it could be in need of a big renovation, right? It might just be outdated. If it's overperforming, why? Maybe it was recently renovated, or they're doing a really good job on sales or retention. But then at the end of the day, in order to put together, any sort of bid on a property, you need to dig into the financials.
Yeah, 100%. And what would you see if you did dig in from, again, that economy class to that higher end hotel? Operationally, what's going on? Obviously, I've been to a motel. I've also I'm lucky to have been to a few nice Marriotts at various times. And, the breakfast, the spread, maybe they have bars and, upscale cocktail bars inside the lobbies. But operationally, what does that look like for the owner of these places?
Yeah, I mean, listen, right? So when you go down the chain scale to economy places that are more, mom and pop type operations, right? It's pretty difficult to generalize because even these folks, even today, they're probably not sticking to a solid structure on their P&L, right? Some folks might not even be generating P&Ls, to this day. That's a very real possibility. But at the end of the day, I think, if you're running an economy hotel and you're running it, not in the sense of you've got proper staffing in place where everyone's getting paid, you could still probably do 40% margins on revenue, NOI margins. That's before your debt service, right? So that's like a pretty lean operation. And that, of course, varies, right? I mean, I take a look at hotels that hit the market constantly, and you'll see large variances where, folks will be doing 20% up to, 45% margins. So that's where the operational expertise comes in. If you're looking at a financial statement for a hotel that's on the market, you can use that as a guidepost, right? But at the end of the day, it is what can I bring operationally to the table, right? Sometimes it's, hey, I can actually improve this, and I know I can. Or sometimes it's like, I can't move this, right? It's being run as lean as possible. So it's a little bit more variable as you go down the chain scale, but as you go kind of up the chain scale, a little bit more predictability, at least in the structure of the P&Ls that you'll look at, right? And so, I mean, at the end of the day, what really matters is on the room revenue side, right, is your flow through. How much of every dollar that you get in room revenue, how much does that flow down to the NOI line, right? And so for upscale hotels, it flips a little bit where, for economy, right, the revenue per room won't be terribly high. Maybe it's 20,000, maybe it's 25,000, right? But then now you get into an upscale hotel where you might be pulling in revenues of, 100,000 a key, right? Just because your rate is hundreds of dollars, your average rate, and you've got high occupancies potentially too. But the cost of servicing that building, the cost of servicing your guests increases, and so when you get down to the bottom line in terms of NOI, those margins might be 20%, 25%. And so then the valuation of each asset typically, will typically go on a cap rate, right? A capitalization rate. So what is the NOI after everything is taken care of before debt service, and you divide that by your cap rate and you get a rough value. And so the interesting thing is that, economy hotels are seen as more volatile. Economy mid-scale, as you go down the chain scale, the lower priced value hotels, they're seen as more volatile because, changes in the economy, it will hit these hotels first, right? Because they are drawing guests that are probably of lower income.
Yeah.
Whereas, when you go up the chain scale to luxury, up through luxury, those guests are less price sensitive. And so they're seen as kind of more stable assets. And so economy hotels will have a high cap rate, whereas luxury hotels will have a much lower cap rate. And so let's just say, for $1 million in NOI, right, just to keep things simple, for $1 million in NOI, if it's an economy hotel, you might divide that by a 10% cap rate and say, okay, this is valued at $10 million. This asset is worth $10 million. Whereas you might have $1 million in NOI at a much nicer hotel, but it's viewed as a much more stable long-term investment, and that might be, an 8% cap rate. So the value of that is, 12, 13 million.
Okay. It makes sense how, just when you think about what you've been sharing as far as kind of the behind the scenes and the ops of these models, and back to that family owner operator model, is there a point where that breaks, where you hit X number of rooms and it's just not feasible and you need to start staffing with outside help?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Right. And I think, I really think it's twofold, right? It's as the number of rooms increase, in order to maintain revenues, you need to sell more, right? If you've got a 50-room hotel versus a 100-room hotel, you need to make sure that you're filling those rooms, right? You're getting heads in beds. And so you might need a component of someone that's actually actively doing sales in your market, right? Making sure that, when you get a request for proposals, let's say if there's a soccer team that's coming into town, they will be contacting the brand directly, and the brand might disseminate a request for proposals in that surrounding area. Say, all hotels, here's a soccer team, they need like 25 rooms for 3 nights. And so you need to have someone that is on top of that and saying, okay, these are the amenities that they need, what kind of rate can we negotiate and get this group in? But you need to devote time to that. And obviously as the number of rooms increases, it just becomes nearly impossible for, physically to do that work, right? Staffing the front desk, if the GM's also acting as a maintenance man, they're going to drop the ball somewhere. And so I kind of put it on the key count As soon as you start passing 50 or 60 units, the owner-operator model kind of breaks down, especially if it's a live-in type of model.
I didn't even think about there's probably corporate deals, right, with companies when like teams are traveling. And I was just thinking, myself, or, onesie, twosie, maybe you're on a road trip or whatever the case is, and you just need somewhere to stop. I'm thinking, why would you even need sales? Like because I just go online and book a hotel. No one has to talk to me. I'm just going to find a convenient spot. But yeah,
Yep.
I could totally see how there's a bunch of situations where there might be larger groups looking to evaluate some quotes, basically.
Yeah, and the segment that I've got, these two hotels in economy segment, we get a lot of business from the local power company, right? So when there's a storm coming through, they expect power outages. They say, hey, we need 20 rooms for the crews that are probably going to have to work overnight. And they're not going to go to the website and book that. They're going to be calling the contact that we have assigned for their account, right? And say, hey, do you guys have rooms? What rate can you give tonight? And so you need to be available to give that to them on the fly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Professional management. I know that exists in the hotel world. Is there a point where that kind of becomes, I don't know if mandatory is the right word, but just where it's the de facto intelligent move?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's obviously where the hotel industry is going in terms of, because, hotels are one of the asset classes where operations really, really, really matters, right? It's kind of, if you look at retail, right? As soon as you get your lease signed and you've filled up all your available spaces, the owner is responsible for collecting the rent and doing common area maintenance, right? But for hotels, there's just a lot more complexity because of the, daily turnover of your inventory, the incredible amount of supplies that need to be, on site, and then of course the staffing. And so the third party management really does start helping in two regards, right? Where, obviously it's got to be a larger hotel. And typically I think, third party management needs to have at least a hotel that's like $4 million in revenue in order to make it make sense. No third party management company is going to want to operate your hotel that's doing $1 million because they'll typically take 3% of revenues off the top. Right? 30 grand is not worth it for them. They need to really cross that $100,000 plus threshold in order to devote resources to managing your hotel. And so that's kind of where it, starts making sense. And that's probably, in terms of key count, it's probably around the 100 or so. But, I think the $4 million revenue is kind of a safe place where you start. And that's also the place where, you've got a reasonably sized hotel, 80 plus units, and you are probably not in the economy or mid-scale segment anymore. You are probably upper mid-scale, upscale through luxury. And so that is going to require just a more professional staffing model. And certainly, you're going to need a full-time person that is doing sales, probably a full-time engineer to make sure that, all of your guest rooms are in top condition, and probably, a general manager and assistant general manager, kind of just to manage that, the entire operation, especially when you add in food and beverage component, right? I mean, putting aside, like, let's say, hotels that offer just a continental breakfast, but as soon as you get into an on-site restaurant, that adds another layer of complexity. And most of the time, hotel restaurants just cannot stand on their own, meaning the revenue that's generated just from guests that are staying at the hotel is not going to be sufficient in order to make a margin there. So you need to have a really good offering when you get to the F&B part that you draw in locals too. That's the only way you're typically going to be able to make that a profit center. And, frankly, a lot of hotel restaurants are not profit centers, right? The rooms department is where the hotel's making money, and you're doing okay if you're breaking even on the food and beverage component.
In some respect, you can view it as, I don't know where it would live on the P&L, but it's like a draw for the guest to book a room because there's a restaurant. Yeah, so.
Exactly. Yep.
All right, I mean, given obviously the numbers you've been throwing out, if you operate a luxury hotel well, cash flow could be very, very high, right?
Yeah.
Like much higher than the economy segment. But in your view, to me, that what you just explained with the luxury hotel, a lot of complexity can be there. You might need professional management. You theoretically have a restaurant baked inside this broader hotel business that's where you have guests probably expecting very timely cleaning staff and all. They just expect not good amenities and the maintenance that goes into these things like pools and whatnot. That's a lot harder in my mind to run well as the owner than if you have a motel that probably has like PTAC HVAC units in every room and that's it. Call it a day there, and that's really all you're getting. Do you think one is better to own than the other?
It just depends on the appetite that you've got, right? And so let's say, like, theoretically, I could gather up the capital and go buy, a beautiful full service Marriott today. I can allocate the capital and then I hire a management company and I'm hands off. I might just meet with them to see what's going on, right? And so with that model, right, like this is like a standard, kind of an acquisitions model. If it's kind of like a well-performing asset, you might expect to be able to generate 10% cash on cash. That's a reasonable return. And then maybe when you sell the asset, hopefully you get into high teens or 20% plus total returns on the deal, right? And so that is kind of that sweet spot for, acquiring, fixing up, and operating a hotel for, let's say, 5 to 7 years. So it is attractive in the sense that you will not find yourself needing to run every aspect of the show, right? And so it is easier to scale that type of model. Versus if I go buy a small 50-room, hotel or a motel, third-party management is not going to be interested in it. This is definitely going to be an owner-operator model, or I hire a general manager that I'm overseeing daily. So you need to be involved in the day-to-day complexities. But again, and I'm just talking from my own personal experience, right? Other folks might have a different view on this. Like the 2 hotels that we own, we also operate. We kind of have a hybrid of typical staff plus having, family as employees there, right? They're obviously, paid employees. But at one of our hotels, we have a beautiful apartment. It's like 5 bedrooms, large living room, beautiful kitchen for our general manager. And he lives there with his family. And we're kind of like trying to combine the best of both worlds, right? Outwardly facing, it is a typical, nice, decent economy hotel. But back of the house, we're operating very leanly. And so we're able to get cash on cash returns in excess of 35%, right? And so even during the downtimes, right? Economy is more volatile to changes in spending, right? Especially consumer spending. During COVID, both of these hotels, we were able to break even, right? We weren't bleeding cash. We were able to get so lean that we were breaking even at a 40% occupancy.
Holy crap.
Whereas if you have a larger hotel that's third-party managed, COVID hits, you're definitely bleeding cash. A lot of hotels that were in our market, that were up the chain scale, right? They had to just shut down because the overhead was just not sustainable. They're like, it's better for us to just shut the hotel down for 6 months, 12 months.
I mean, this professional management, though, I'm sure it's not. I know that whoever owns the hotel there's probably still a lot to do, right? But what can you tell me about these companies? Because the way you explained it in your example of if you wanted to raise capital to acquire a Marriott or something, I mean, you basically just bring in the management company and they do most of the work. Is that, because to me, that sounds like a very complex job. So why aren't they just buying hotels themselves if they're this good at operating them? I guess is maybe what my question is.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these management companies also own hotels on their own. But hotels are very capital thirsty, right?
Yeah.
In terms of acquiring them and maintaining them, right? And so organically, it's hard to grow. Meaning just being able to reinvest profits into your, from your portfolio to acquire new hotels, that's difficult. So that it becomes a capital raising problem. And so these hotel management companies are definitely more specialized in the day-to-day operations of an asset versus going out to the market and, raising equity from private investors. There's an element of that, but so that's where they kind of come together, right?
It just sounds so difficult to be a management. I mean, you're literally just you're just managing a massive labor force, which
I agree.
People cause all sorts of problems.
Yep. So,
sounds like a brutal business to be in.
Yeah, it's definitely not a cakewalk.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Okay. Crazy that. I mean, every franchise owner, that's usually most problems, or not necessarily problems, but just like constraints are usually around labor, finding good people, those kinds of things. So, and building a good culture. Those are the hard things. But so if you're a professional management company, I mean, your whole job is just finding people, and it's just pure operations, which, I mean, it's just sounds like an absolute grind.
Yep, and I mean, even these management companies, they, at their portfolio hotels, they're going to see this turnover, of course, right? And so the advantage you get to having the management company is that, let's say I've got a hotel that I've given to a management company to operate. And I know that GM is not going to stay there forever. One day if he decides, he's not returning, or the assistant GM, the management company has folks that can act as GMs like that. And so if your GM leaves, or some key staff member leaves on short notice, they will fly that person out from headquarters and they will move into your hotel and run the show, right? So that is kind of a big advantage versus, if I'm an owner operator of a larger hotel and key staff members leaves, what am I doing? I'm going to go to the hotel and fill in, right? So you
Yeah.
don't have that support. So it's a key benefit.
Tough, man. You briefly, I think, got into this, but I don't know if we fully like dove down this, which is I know, but on our last call before this, you mentioned there's like a cap rate arbitrage in the economy sector. Is that kind of what you were touching on with what you were able to do during COVID?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think so. You can find arbitrages in any industry, right? It just depends on how long they last. But I think, on the economy side, if you can, or just going down the chain scale to hotel types that you can certainly operate efficiently, right, without the need for a large staffing model. And so I'll put economy, mid-scale, even extended stay hotels that have a lighter staffing model than your typical upscale full service hotels. And so just like we said before, where if you're willing to manage the operations of one of these hotels, you can get lean just because the value in some of these brands, it's not that we're going to wait on you hand and foot like the Ritz-Carlton, right? We're giving you a clean room to sleep and a very basic breakfast, right? The expectations are much lower versus a luxury brand. And so, of course, you can staff lighter, but if you can achieve the same level of NOI as an upscale hotel, right? But you can buy that NOI for much cheaper, right? For a 10% cap rate versus an 8% cap rate. But again, you are taking on implicitly the fact that your asset class or your, where you are on the chain scale is probably going to be a little bit more exposed to volatility in terms of revenues, right? So if you can weather the storm when the market drops, right, just so to say, you can probably do pretty well. And, I just say this from, my own experience and experience of a lot of family friends that have went from, having a number of economy hotels going up the chain scale. And the only reason that they were able to save up all that equity to buy a nicer hotel was because they had high cash flowing motel assets.
yeah, it's just interesting because I feel like a lot of people wouldn't, from the outside, again, I spent a lot of time in the QSR world, and a lot of QSR operators wouldn't know the first thing about it. At least maybe they would, but I don't think so. I feel like the perspective is just, like who would want to own a motel? But, hearing you talk about, if you know what you're doing, you can generate some really good results here. And obviously, like the capital hurdle to like the barrier to entry, I think scares away a lot of people, which is understandable. But kind of a random question here as we start to finish this up is just from your perspective. I mean, you've seen a lot between Driftwood and growing up in this business and now owning some motels yourself. What is the reason? Why do these hotel brands create so many different sub brands underneath them? I think Marriott has about 35 separate brands that roll up to it. And it just feels like, why does there need to be that many? I understand like you want a luxury offering, you want a budget offering, but 35 is like excessive. Is there a reason?
That's it's really interesting that you bring that up, right? Because I think that's a constant point of tension between franchisees and these hotel brands, right? Franchisees are consistently saying, why do you keep inventing new brands to dilute the market? From the franchisor's perspective, a new brand can create some excitement, drive obviously more reservations, but they're slicing up the consumer market, very, very finely. And of course, there's a point at which it doesn't make sense. So, I'm not going to opine on who's right, who's wrong here. But I think it's the hotel brands need to compete with each other, create excitement for their particular brand, and, try to capture business away from the competitor, right? So Marriott wants to have, let's say, the best extended stay products compared to Hilton. So how can they achieve that? So that's one piece, right? Analyzing the consumer and their needs, so which might be completely valid. But then on the other side of it is that, hotels are a very long-term real estate investment, right? Asset class. So when you sign a franchise agreement, you'll probably be signing a franchise agreement from 15 up to 25 years. And so at some point, that Hampton Inn gets really old. Hey, this was built 20 years ago, and our newest Hampton Inn prototype is completely different from this guy that built it 20 years ago. And so what they want to do is either be able to take that brand, transition it into a lower class brand, but still within Hilton, Marriott, and so they'll invent it, right? So like, let's say Hilton just came out with an economy brand called Spark, and their play is take all the old Hampton Inns and slowly push them into Spark by Hilton. That is our economy brand. So we keep them within the Hilton family, and we get exposure to the economy segment as well. And that, when a Hampton Inn moves over to, let's say, a Spark, and now there's no Hampton in that market, they'll get a new developer that will say, okay, I'll build a new Hampton Inn here, right? And so now they've got a new Hampton Inn product that they can sell. It's probably going to outperform on rate compared to the old one.
Damn. So it literally can be just the franchisee doesn't want to front the capex, which would be quite a lot, to modernize their existing brand. So the franchisor, hey, just slap a new sign on it. We have a new budget brand. You're now a budget hotel owner, not a Hampton owner.
Exactly. And in some cases, no amount of capex on an old building will let you keep the license. When your license expires, they're like, nope, we're not going to renew this license. The newest prototype is just too far from what you've got. And so now you just got to go find another brand.
That's fascinating. I mean, how do you feel about that from the franchisee perspective? Are you thinking if you buy into a brand, you're like, no, like I want to stay up to date because I bought this model? Or is it as long as my...
No, I mean, the license term on these brands is very long, right? Like I said, minimum 15. Some of them are 20, 25-year license agreements. And so that hotel has probably undergone multiple rounds of ownership during that period. And so there does come a time when it just doesn't make sense to keep an old hotel within the same brand anymore, right? Because the health of the brand, you want a lot of consistency, right? That's what they're selling, consistency. You stay at one Hampton in Connecticut, you stay at a Hampton in, Montana. Yeah. It's got to be a very similar experience, or else you're just diluting the brand.
100%. Super interesting, man. To wrap up here, what are your goals going forward? Do you ever plan to leave Driftwood and go full-time as the hotel entrepreneur, or do you kind of like the balance? Or maybe
no, I like the balance. I like the balance for sure because I get to do very interesting data science, AI work, apply that to the hotel space. And then, I've got kind of a small family portfolio. And so I can be involved in that at a high level. Yeah, right now I'm at the intersection of the best of both worlds. So no plans to change.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on, man. And where could people follow along who maybe just want to learn from you and follow your journey in the hotel space?
I'm not a big social media guy, but you can find me on LinkedIn.
Cool. Okay. We'll post the profile in the show notes, folks, if you want to follow along with Keni. But yeah, man, look, this was awesome. Kind of going through the full evolution of motels in America. And I appreciate you coming on. I think this will be a good conversation for the audience.